Thank you, Ambassador Park. Most of us take a scene like this for granted, but 5-6 years ago, putting together panelists from the US, China, and South Korea in one place on North Korean issue was very difficult. So I think there has been a big step made, and I would like to commend KFAS and Ambassador Park for setting up a meeting like this, which is very important at this particular time and point. I think basically North Korea has made it very clear that getting nuclear weapons and not giving them up is their goal. And thinking otherwise at this point is probably anachronistic. And I do not think anyone in the audience would think that way. So in that respect, I think sanctions, particularly encapsulated in the UNSCR 2270, are very useful. However, I think as I read through the resolution, I thought there were some loopholes. And given the fact that there are loopholes, and here we'll already talk about dialogues or parallel talks, I think that's somewhat not helpful in actually achieving the goal of denuclearization. Because stopping halfway with the sanctions will not really help. I think not only South Korea, but also many countries, including the US, tend to have a sort of inclination to underestimate North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile technologies in the past years, as well as to underestimate the resilience of the North Korean regime. I think that has been what we have been doing in the last 20-some years. But as Ambassador Park has summarized very well, North Korea's nuclear capabilities and missile technologies now are completely different from 10 years, not to speak of 20 years ago. So I think it really depends on how durable and consistent our application of sanctions would be. I think we need a lot more than 6 months. I think we need at least a year. But whether that can be sustained in the real setting, that remains a real question. Another issue concerns US-China relations, because how far is the United States willing to go in implementing the secondary boycott? In other words, in dealing with Chinese corporations which engage in illicit businesses with North Korean companies that were listed on the UNSCR 2270. A lot of people compare the North Korean case with the Iranian case. The total trade volume of North Korea is only 1/10 of Iran. And North Korea doesn't really have the institutionalized market per se. That means North Korea is much less vulnerable to the sanctions that we are now applying against North Korea. And North Korea is very familiar and used to the so-called arduous march. They are really well adapted to difficult times. So it would be too optimistic for us to come up with a conclusion that sanctions will work. If we go back 3 years ago, in 2013, right after the third nuclear test by North Korea, there were sanctions, there were some measures implemented by China, including the suspension of bank accounts, Chinese bank accounts used by North Korean companies. And there were a lot of media reports which were actually flooding. But in retrospect, they were not really useful. So we need to be very sober about the effectiveness of these sanctions. That means not only South Korea, but also the countries involved need Plan B, Plan C. And rather than thinking too prematurely about having these parallel talks. Another thing is, what if sanctions actually work after 6 months or a year, and North Korea comes out to the table, negotiation table? Then we are already, again confronted with a familiar dilemma. How can we rely on their sincerity this time? How can we actually validate it? Because unlike 5 years, 10 years ago, they might have some larger number of places where they have been conducting this experiments, tests, and whatever you have. Fundamentally, I think internal cohesion of the concerned party is the most important. I think that is a view that's shared by many concerned parties on this issue. In that respect, I think US-China cooperation is really important. As the power gap between the US and China narrows down, I think my own view is that US-China relations are being transformed from a sort of cooperation-based competition toward a competition-based cooperation, which is only going to be a selective cooperation. And I think I have two working hypotheses. In other words, if a policy at hand is geographically further away from Asia, there is a high likelihood of cooperation between Washington and Beijing, because China considers Asia as its backyard as well as a traditional sphere of influence. The other hypothesis, if the policy at hand has a less component of hard security, the likelihood of cooperation between Washington and Beijing is higher. Then what about North Korea? North Korea is right in the middle of East Asia, and North Korean issue is a hard security issue. Therefore, achieving US-China cooperation is going to be very difficult. So it provides us a very good litmus test as to whether the G2 can really come up with a cooperative package to make real contributions to the international community. Now let me get down to the concrete question as to the divergences of the US and China on the North Korean issue. I think there are many divergences. Of course, there are some convergences, but there are many divergences. First one, who is to blame for the failure of the six-party talks or the efforts of resolving this issue for the last 25 years? China blames US blames China. I think both are to blame. China is responsible for benign neglect for the last 20 years. I think US is partly responsible for strategic patience, which I still do not quite understand what it really means. Second, I think China's view of nuclear weapons development and missile technologies is a bit different from the US. US is much more concerned about non-proliferation of technologies and weapons. But China, on the basis of its own experiences of the 50s and 60s, tends to consider nuclear weapons development and missile technologies as belonging to a sort of sovereign realm of a sovereign country, particularly with regard to missile technologies. And threat perception of North Korea is quite different. I mean, China perceives North Korea not to be that threatening, despite the fact that it borders on North Korea, which is developing nuclear weapons. And usual answer that you get from Chinese experts is that you already have Russia, India, Pakistan, which have nuclear weapons. So having another one on its border would have very little or lower marginal threat perception. US, of course, is very different. It doesn't have any nuclear weapon states along its borders. And also, I think in terms of empathy toward the so-called legitimate security concerns that North Korea has toward the United States, I think this is also based on a very different experience of China, because China perceived the US as a threat in the 50s and 60s. So I think they can more easily sympathize with North Korea as far as the US as a security threat is concerned. And also US and China differ quite a bit on the utility and the legitimacy of the unilateral sanctions other than multilateral sanctions from the United Nations. There is also a very big difference between the US and China on the question of pursuing a regime change in North Korea. So there are many differences. If I may add one more, China's 3-no policy is no nukes, no war, no stability. But America's unofficial 3 no's are no more nukes, no better nukes, no proliferation. So there's not much of an overlap, although a lot of people think there is a much overlap. And I wonder what South Korea's no policy is about this nuclear issue. Now let me talk a little bit about China's policy toward North Korea I think this is the most controversial and debatable issue in the last couple of years. As I mentioned earlier, after the third nuclear test in 2013, many Korean news media, not just Korean though, but many Korean news media flooded with reports saying that China's policy on North Korea has really changed. I was very doubtful. I think today we heard Professor Jae-Ho Chung's remarks on that. That I think confirms what I have been talking about. However, I think in tactical terms there have been some changes. I'm not quite sure whether these tactical changes will, in the long run, be transformed into strategic changes in China's policy toward North Korea. But I think China is, first of all, unhappy about North Korea doing these nuclear tests on its border. Particularly after the third test in 2013, there were many reports, including some internal reports in China, that are concerned about radiation effects in the northeast provinces. I think this has created certain incentive for China to be more louder on this North Korean nuclear issue. And China is not happy about brazen North Korea. North Korea doesn't listen to China. Think about the fact that North Korea launched long-range missiles on the day the Representative Woo Da-wei visited Pyongyang. So I think this was really a slap in the face. And given the fact that China really cares about the face, Mianzi, I think it was really a serious issue for Beijing. However, the cooperation and friendship treaty between Beijing and Pyongyang is still intact. And China's view of North Korea as a buffer, I think, still remains. So with those issues still in place, it is difficult for me to think that there will be a strategic change in China's policy toward North Korea, although I admit there have been tactical adjustments in China's dealing with North Korea. Finally, how do you actually secure stability on the Korean Peninsula situation? It all depends on how you define stability. Do you equate stability with the status quo, or are you referring to a piecemeal changes without military conflict? But I think, as the situation suggests us, both options will become increasingly more difficult to come up with a really effective resolution of the issue. First of all, I think on this particular issue, United States and China tend to be independent variables. And South Korea has, as I mentioned, US, China have these no policies, whether it's a 3 or 4, but I'm not quite sure what South Korea's specific framework is, except for we are opposed to nukes in North Korea. So whether or not the South Korea can become and partly an independent variable in this very complex situation, that is going to be very important. And down the road, if there is no resolution with regard to North Korea's nuclear weapons program, then I think there will be a accumulated frustrations and helplessness perceived by Korean people, which is not going to be a very good news. And also, it's not going to be very good news for the US-Korea alliance as well, because thus far, only one dimension of the US-Korea alliance has been highlighted, that is a security guarantor and provision of defense for South Korea. But any alliance has another dimension, which is a double containment. That means US may be perceived as constraining South Korea's option, because US and China can be perceived as countries which are more interested in management rather than resolution, while South Korea is more interested in resolution. I'll stop there. Thank you.